Hi, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live broadcast on the May ISM Report on Business. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm a senior writer and copy editor for Inside Supply Management. That's Institute for Supply Management's member publication, and we're excited that you're joining us today for this kind of a special edition as we break down the manufacturing and the services PMI data for April. ISM's annual conference in Orlando, Florida, and the associated travels forced us to kind of call an audible here, but this should be a lot of fun today because we get to discuss both reports, and both composite indexes were in contraction territory. The manufacturing PMI at 48.5% and the services PMI at 49.9%. That's the first time the latter index has been below the 50% threshold for the first time in 11 months. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm excited to bring in our chairs. Susan Spence is the chair of the ISM Manufacturing Business Services Committee, and Steve Miller is the chair of the ISM Services Business Survey Committee. Friends, I am so excited. We've got the whole band together today, especially because we have a new member. And May was Sue's first report as the manufacturing chair. Welcome aboard.
Thanks, Dan. Really happy to be here.
Sue has 3 decades of experience in aerospace procurement and manufacturing. She recently retired from FedEx, where she centralized sourcing operations for the company and its divisions, and she's the 2020 recipient of the J. Shipman Gold Medal Award, which is presented by ISM for career achievement. So she brings a lot of expertise and experience to this position, and we're excited to have her. Hey, Sue, I'll start with you. In your interviews last week, I really liked how you related the PMI data to your experience in procurement and manufacturing, especially how it reflected the challenges of those jobs, especially right now. As an introduction of sorts, before we start breaking down the May data, just wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience about working on the report for the first time. Did it offer any fresh perspectives on the manufacturing sector from your experience, or affirm longstanding principles?
Yeah, it did. The sub-indexes, there's 10 of them. Of course, 5 go into the PMI. I wish that, years ago that I had paid a little more attention to that. I would certainly read the report. But in studying how everything came together, because it was important to get up to speed on all of that, really watching each of those indexes, and especially watching them month to month, really gives some good early warning to the people that, take the time to study them. So it made perfect sense to me. I did a little practice run in April when Tim was still in role. My learning from April to May was really, really huge. Especially in light of what's going on in the business environment we're in with tariffs, which that will be the word of the day. So, it's an interesting time to step into the role. There's chaos, there's confusion, there's stress, there's everything. I do feel for our purchasing managers that are still working. I'm really, really happy to be retired right now, but it's wonderful to see the leading edge data that can kind of inform what's happening, and then seeing it month to month. And recognizing the patterns, and, in a time of chaos, I think it helps.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you mentioned that chaos and confusion, and you said tariffs were going to be the word of the day. I do think everybody knew that long before we signed on here. So let's get right to it. Steve, I'll start with you. Tariffs did have a big impact on the data and the panelist comments in both the manufacturing and the services reports in May, especially in services, which many can be under the impression that it's kind of somewhat insulated from tariffs. Kind of discuss the impacts on your respective sectors, especially that you noticed in the data and comments for May. Steve, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So we had comments around, do we actually see impact, or are we concerned about it, and is it impacting our planning? It was kind of flat month over month in terms of, is it impacting our planning? But we saw a slight increase in terms of the actual cost flowing through. So not a positive sign there, along with the prices index in seeing how that's impacting us. The other thing that actually came through conversations from the ISM conference is what people were saying was that suppliers of theirs are starting to slow down their production given uncertainty of future orders. And that, together with the tariff concern and uncertainty, has company or industries like utilities, where they might have a 2-year lead on getting a piece of equipment, is a big concern, because we saw that in the semiconductor industry when people didn't put orders in back in the recovery from COVID. They ended up being impacted for literally years after that slowdown. So you have utilities, you have construction, you have retail, wholesale, a lot of different industries that are fairly obvious when you look at them. But then when you look at hospitality and restaurant, a lot of food, especially seafood, is coming from overseas. So it impacts really across the board from a services perspective.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the impact of tariffs on the manufacturing sector, Sue, are no secret. Just talk about what you found there in the May report.
Let me start with a comment. I'll probably repeat myself. If there's something happening, you're going to see it first in manufacturing. That makes perfect sense to me. And Steve teed that up nicely because the services folks are buying the stuff, right? The goods that they need to perform their services. So, the tariff impact started very, very quickly when Tim was still in role. And, you see continued drop in production and employment as well. And then imports, right? The lowest level since May 2009, right? The global economic downturn known now as the Great Recession. So the uncertainty that's been wrought on the manufacturing industry cannot be overstated. We're not Chicken Little. We're not, crying wolf or whatever bad analogy you care to use. It's real. It's happening. And the impact is leading to people, as Steve said, not doing the things they'd normally do because of uncertainty. So, I took a look at the tariff timeline and counted 32 days where there was either something announced, reversed, put on hold, or a country doing reciprocal tariffs. I don't remember ever, pandemic was really, really bad when I was, still in the working world. But at least the world was pulling in the right direction and they were trying to solve it together. So the whiplash and those resultant impacts are not only not saving Americans money, it's costing jobs, and it's going to continue to contract in manufacturing. And so we need some certainty. We need things settled so that people can believe it and start to row in the right direction to get back on track.
Yeah. And one of those indexes was, as it relates to the report on business, where you can feel the impact of that is in supplier deliveries. Typically, as a brief tutorial, that index is the only one that's inversed. If it's above 50, that means inventories are slower, which is typical as the economy improves and demand increases. That's not what we're seeing here. I think everyone agrees on that. It's an indicative of supply chain bottlenecks and confusions, as kind of what we saw during COVID as well. And one manufacturing panelist, in fact, had a comment that the bottlenecks compare to COVID-19. So, you can consider that hyperbolic, but I mean, that's a guy that's in there on the front lines. So, Sue, I'll go back to you. Yeah, just give us the lowdown on lead times and deliveries and just what we're seeing.
Certainly. And that COVID comment there was more than one in the over 200 survey comments that I read. So certainly didn't think I'd see that again. And that was a comment of the survey panelist as well. So, the congestion makes sense. The port congestion, I read something about in Long Beach, there was a 30% drop, after the pull forward was complete, and truckers that were picking up 2 loads a day were lucky if they got 2 loads a week. But the pull forward material is largely through. And with the continued contraction in backlog, both new orders and export orders, as things start to slow down, the supplier deliveries continue to be an issue. But I think that the whole discussion about who's going to pay and negotiations. So like the pandemic, you've got a contract with pricing. That's great until it's not, because the company that's supplying you cannot afford a 20 or 30% increase. They're going to pass it on, or they may have to walk away from your contract. And I worry about that happening.
Yeah. Just for a point of reference, supplier deliveries index for manufacturing in May was 56.1%. That was up 0.9 of a percentage point. For services, Steve, 52.5. That also increased 1.2 percentage points. Just what did you see on the services side?
Yeah, Dan, the commentary reinforced a lot of what Sue is just talking about. So that the impact to production activities is one piece, and that we see is going to, from a supplier or from a purchasing perspective, we see is going to continue to be an impact the longer that this goes on. I believe it was it a month for every day that the Suez Canal accident was? It was something like that, or 2 weeks for every day to recover. So if you're down for a month, long time. The same thing for constrained businesses or supply constraints when they're not producing because they don't have firm demand. And we saw that on the services side. There isn't firm demand. There's a reduction in new orders. There's a reduction in backlog. At the same time that supplier deliveries are getting longer. That's not a great situation, and it isn't something that's going to be fixed in 1 month. So that's one of the, I'll call it a yellow flag that's out there. It depends how quickly things get settled, how quickly recovery will happen.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some specific index readings as it relates to your specific sectors that you cover. Steve, I know when the composite PMI came out and it was in contraction, you made the point that it is a mild contraction, which 49.9 definitely is, and should not spark any lingering worries about a long-term contraction or a recession. But you kind of did some sobering math on the average of the new orders and the backlog of orders indexes, which of course are two very important indexes to measure demand. And I'll read them, the specific readings in May. New orders was 46.4%. That was down 5.9% compared to April. Backlog of orders, 43.4%. That went down 4.6% compared to the previous month. You kind of did some math on the average of the new orders and the backlog of orders indexes as of late. What did you find, and how big of a concern is it?
So the first thing I'd say, Dan, is that I'm not an economist.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for trends and numbers and trying to identify things that look odd to me, and that was one. So we'll see over the next month or so how significant that is. But the only time we got to an average of 44.9 in the last 20 years were the first 2 months, or two of the first 3 months of the COVID shutdown activities, and right in the middle of 2008, 2009, when we had the Great Recession. So really, really bright flashing light for me, where, if you have new orders and high business activity and backlog is going down, you can say, okay, productivity, some improvements in processes, normal, maybe a summer spike or seasonal type activity where to hire ahead and get that in place. But where you're seeing business activity decrease or flat month over month, and then the 4% reduction in those other two indexes isn't trivial. Those are big numbers. So for me, that's a big flashing red light.
Yeah. Really, especially because we kind of marveled. Data or demand had kind of been resilient in the services sector for a long time, while the rest of the economy was kind of sluggish. And now we're starting to see it there. So that will be something to keep an eye on, definitely, in the coming months. What Sue has been keeping an eye on in the manufacturing sector is production. And she's mentioned here her predecessor a couple of times in this broadcast. His name is Tim Fiore. He oversaw the report for 7 or 8 years. And in his last report, which was in April, he called the production index number. I will get that exact number for you. It was 44%. He called it alarming. It ticked up a little bit in May to 45.4%. But on the interviews that you did last week, Sue, you expressed concerns about the production number, especially as it relates to current situations regarding inventories and backlogs and imports. Just to kind of explain what you were talking about there, and how big of a concern is that for you?
It's a huge concern for me. Again, I don't mean to overstate. I know it is only a couple months in for me, but having done the job of the purchasing manager for over 35 years, this information made sense to me. So the situation is demand remains weak, right? We have backlog, new export orders, new orders, and customer inventories making up demand. When customer inventories get low and stay low, eventually there's a trigger point to reorder. Maybe that's the bright spot. But, the contraction, especially if you look at backlogs, there was an uptick in that, but it's still contracting and has been for 32 months. So not good. And with orders and new export orders continuing to contract, it's just, it's not a good scenario. So, again, I'm going to point to the uncertainty, not because I'm brilliant, right? But because 86% of our panelists said that's what's going on, right? Tariffs have frozen us. We're not sure what's going to happen. We're holding back on hiring replacements. Continued layoffs are going on as well. So how long will it take for customer reordering to come roaring back? Steve said it well. I think we're in it for a bit. And one of the questions I got on our press day last week was, are these permanent, reductions, or is this a quick fix once it has resolved itself with policy that we stick with? And my answer was, it's not permanent, but it's not quick. I think, what we're hearing is, listen, if things got settled and agreed upon and didn't change again by the end of the summer, it's months after that, right? Lead times vary depending if you're in, the apparel industry or the aerospace industry, but it will take some time. I think a big key is whether people will believe regardless of what the policy is, will they believe that it's going to stick and not change? Because that has certainly been the whiplash. It is this, no, it's not. Well, it's this, we're going to change that. That is as destructive. I think as you're costing out a bill of material, you know how to reprice your bill of material, and the purchasing manager gets to go do that on a regular basis, depending what's going on. When he has to do it or she has to do it weekly, they don't have time for a whole lot else. But the CFO needs to know how to price product. So, if this scenario happens with China or with Europe, what does it mean? How far am I going to get squeezed? What do I try to pass on to my customer? And just a continued cycle of that.
Yeah.
Is good, not good.
Yeah. Hey, Sue, let me follow up with that, because you mentioned customer inventories and you were referring to the customer inventories index. And for people who don't know what that means or what it measures, it basically measures the amount of products on shelves. And the lower it is, that typically means you got to get to a point where you have to reorder.
Right.
And in May, it was at 44.5%. That was actually down 1.7%.
Right.
Kind of sounds like, I discussed it with Tim in his last report. Basically, if you were looking for one ray of sunshine in the manufacturing report the last couple of months, customers' inventories is probably it, because it reflects an index number where at some point people have to reorder. But it kind of sounds, Sue, like, they're still, because of the uncertainty, they're still waiting to pull the trigger on that.
Yeah. And maybe it's different. Maybe this is informed speculation. Customers have to order, do they? What if they don't believe that the demand is coming back? Follow that all the way through the supply chain. So, certainly there's some things that have to be reordered and they have very long lead time, but it feels like they're in the same boat as the whole supply chain. What's going to happen? How is the American consumer going to react if some of these things stick? Will they make different choices? And so trying to have a crystal ball to predict customer behavior, it's difficult.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Another specific index that came up in last month was related to services. It got a lot of chatter, especially because it came out on the same day as a disappointing ADP report for jobs. It was the Services Employment Index, which was an expansion. It was 50.7%, up 1.7 percentage points from the previous month. And Steve, there were some chatter that, that really didn't mesh with that ADP report, was kind of a disappointment. But, you kind of explained the last 2 months, the ISM index, the employment index, kind of serves as a leading indicator a little bit for the ADP and BLS data. Just kind of elaborate on that, and what does the main number, what might it suggest for the future?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Looking back for the last, since the pandemic, in a very high percentage of the cases when ADP was weak, we saw weaker employment numbers in services 1 to 2 months prior to those numbers being weak. We saw that for not this month, but the prior 2 months, we saw below 50, so slight contraction in employment. So the ADP numbers being weak this month was not a surprise. I expect we'll see a weak report in July as well. Question though is, going forward, do we think it's still going to continue to be weak? Because just over 50 is not a huge expansion, and especially not after 2 months of contraction. So I can't look too much further out than next month, but I would expect next month to be another weak month. We saw, prior to that, we saw strength. ADP number last month, we saw strength. So I think it's the trend and the matchup is continuing.
Yeah. Well, it's been it's been such an eventful month. We're like 20 minutes, more than 20 minutes into the call, and we're talking about the prices index for the first time. So that gives you an idea of how eventful things are. But they are high numbers in relation to what they normally are. For of course, both reports pushing towards 70%. I'll give you the exact numbers for manufacturing. It was 69.4 in May, which was actually down 0.4 percentage points, and in services, it was 68.7%, which was up 3.6 percentage points. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the stratospheric numbers we saw during COVID, but still, disturbingly high. And while the hard data is on inflation has kind of eased in recent months, putting aside some of the concerns that some economists have expressed in recent days about the quality of the federal data, I mean, how should the ISM indexes be interpreted in relation to, say, the inflation rate? And, what could the current prices environment mean for interest rates? That always gets a lot of chatter when people look at those prices index numbers, thinking about how the Fed might respond to those. Steve, I'll start with you.
It's a tough situation.
Yeah.
We see weakness in demand, but we see escalating prices.
Mm-hmm.
And if tariffs stick, it's going to be even more so. So you got to be very conscious of money supply. And with the tax bill, it's going to increase money supply because we're going to reduce personal taxes. So, and extend business taxes, but that won't be an increase on the business side, but on the personal side, it will be. So I think they're in a pretty tough spot. The thing about inflation is that prices don't come back down again. So when we saw this last 2 month or the 2 months increase in the prices index, the last time we saw a 2 month increase like this was just at the beginning of the inflation spike within COVID. Mm-hmm. To me, that would be the thing that would govern my decision making at this point, is that when you get up to 8, 9, 10% inflation rate, it's permanent. Just a lot of things that get into the deficit and the national debt and things like that I think make even more sense to not cut rates yet. But that's just a personal view in terms of fiscal responsibility and where we should be. I think if the money supply stays fairly constrained, the pressure will be on purchasing activities and keeping prices flat, or choosing what you will buy versus what you won't buy, which will just create that inherent cap on the actual price flow through.
Sue?
So in the manufacturing sector, prices have been on the rise for 8 months. It's not a new phenomenon. So what I've been thinking about is, what portion of that is normal price increase versus anticipatory, right? There's a phrase that's folks might raise prices because their costs are going up, or they might raise prices because they can. Tim talked about a short ton of steel going from 600 to 900. And so Steve's right. They come up, they don't come back down. You wish they would. So, they're here, and, the threat of new tariffs, being launched on everybody, basically, is the concern. So, there's a lot written, of course, about the tension between the administration and the Fed. I think Tim said it well last month. Interest rate cuts is not going to solve the uncertainty that's going on right now. Everywhere I've worked, when you don't know what's going to happen to your order book and your backlog, you're going to freeze on certain things. Capital expenditures is one. Hiring replacements is another. And you're going to just try to hold on. And, as far as layoffs is concerned, a lot of our panel, most are, handling workforce that way. Eventually, you're going to have to readjust your cost structure to be in line with what you're seeing not come in the door from your customers. So the prices continue to go up because they can or they must. And again, broken record here. You just want to drive a message that the only thing that's going to help is to have a settlement on these issues and not continue to change that. We hope that the consequences of the tariffs are based on fact, right? And what behavior the customers will have and what the realities of business is for flowing through increases to the customer. Companies are there to make profit. That's their job. They have a fiduciary responsibility to do that. And folks that think that companies are just going to absorb them, I don't think are based in reality, with all due respect. So just needs to settle down, need to get decisions here that are going to be final so the business world can deal with it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got about 3 minutes left. And one question that I always ask, I definitely want to give you guys an opportunity to discuss anything that I didn't ask or anything that we haven't discussed to this point as it relates to your respective reports, what you think it might be important for our viewers to know. Yeah, Sue, I'll start with you and manufacturing.
Yeah. So if I'm a CEO, knowing that there's a lot of things out of my control, which is not comfortable for CEOs to realize that, I'm going to focus on my supplier relationships, on trying to understand who will bear the cost of tariffs, depending on what scenario you pick, making sure it is understood what the stream of incoming materials looks like so that when demand comes back, especially given the increasing in supplier deliveries and lead time, there's a realistic view of what production could look like. Reshoring is a big topic. It takes a long time to open a factory. So those decisions, can be made in light of today's environment, but understanding if it's 2 years down the road before you can open the doors, is that still a good decision? And, I also would say, please do appreciate your procurement team, your supply management team. They have been on the front lines before. They're warriors. They got us through the pandemic, and you just need to give them some extra love. As far as, what was that? I was asked something, it didn't come up today. Although I think I mentioned it. It was, how long would it take to recover? That was a big topic in my interviews. And again, we say it's not permanent damage, but it's not an immediate fix either. So reiterating what we've been saying, need to settle the policy questions, make the decisions, and get on with it. People want to get on with it.
Yeah. Steve.
Two related things. One is there's some concern over the strength of business going forward. And the other side of it is in our services index, the percentage of GDP represented by industries that are saying they're in expansion is higher this month than it's been the last 2 months. So, and the commentary on top of that has been business is strong, meeting plan, not a lot of orders are being canceled, we're laying people off and that type of thing. So I think strength within the business community is good. There's concern though on hitting revenues. If you have services suppliers, and the supply chain forecast that just came out last month said that services suppliers or services companies are projecting flat revenues year over year. As the CEO, I'd be talking to my supply management company and say, talk to your services suppliers, ones that we know we're going to be using for a couple of years from now, renegotiate deals, extend deals, get things in place that work in our economics and work with their confidence. And we'll come out of this very well.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about with the indexes and the dynamics and how it fits to everyday business for procurement and supply executives. And I wish we had another half hour to keep talking about it because it was a great conversation. Hey, Sue and Steve, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your time. And thanks to you for joining us today. For more information, feel free to go to ismworld.org, where you can read our roundup articles and other coverage that details a lot of what Sue, Steve, and I have discussed here. And if you want to be a part of the ISM Manufacturing Services or Hospital Business Survey panels that help compile data for the Report on Business, visit ismworld.org/join the panel for more information. Next month, we expect to be back to a normal schedule, so join us on July 1st when Sue joins me to break down the Junior Manufacturing PMI, and on the 3rd when Steve joins me to discuss the Services PMI. So for Susan Spence, Steve Miller, and especially the good people behind the scenes that help make the three of us look good every month, their names are Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens. I'm Dan Zeiger, and we'll see you next time.